Hey all, it's your boy Remoy George Phillip the First. Today is part 2 of me and Samantha's episode with Dr. William Liu. Dr. Liu is a clinical psychologist and the editor of the Psychology of Men and Masculinity journal. His research kind of crosshairs in on race and masculinity, so last week we went in and talked all about hegemony, white supremacy, and the struggles of being a man of color. So if you haven't listened to last week's episode, hit pause, go back to part 1, peep it, leave us a review, and then hit play back on part 2 where we take this conversation even further. All right, all, it's time for that part 2, and it's time for the Masculinity Podcast. Enjoy!
Well, I think one of the things that you were mentioning in terms of, well, there's so much stuff that you said that's so great, and the thing that really stays with me is the value of being oneself, right? So, because when you're saying, that men of color, well, maybe you didn't say that exactly, but men of color in the negotiation of their own masculinity, navigating these spaces, there's an expectation that there's a part of themselves that's going to be muted, that's going to have to be muted because they're not white, and like that part is not welcome here, so to speak. And so, what I'm concerned with is the impact of that on a person, on a man who, and I mean, I think we'll get to also kind of how that ties into the performance of masculinity later, specifically within communities of color, with women of color, with people along the gender spectrum. And the value that we're now assigning to people is the ability to navigate this world that essentially they're only privy to because of whatever value they bring financially, right? If we're being honest, within any kind of business context. So, in your research and then the results of the clinical work that you've done, what is the impact for men of color of having to navigate that? And specifically, I'm really interested in this notion of them being valued not for being themselves, but for playing the part.
Yeah. That basically is this idea of being tokenized, right? And for people of color in many of these white dominant spaces, in these institutional spaces, being tokenized means that we really have to recognize that the attention and the privileges that we're getting are very limited. They're limited to that space, they're limited to that time, and they're largely limited to individual white people who have deemed you as an important asset to that space, right? So you're literally tied to like individual white people, because once they leave, then those privileges and that attention that you were afforded goes away. There's nothing permanent about it. It's much different in terms of if you're a white person in that space, those privileges continue no matter where you go, no matter where you are. You're just afforded that privilege. But for people of color in these institutional spaces, we're very much limited to what I would deem to be this idea of proxy privilege, which is that the things, the affordances, and the privileges that we receive are almost tied to individual white people that we're close to. So for instance, as a Asian American, as a man of color, as a professor in a largely white institution at the University of Iowa, for instance, everybody knows me in my building, in the College of Education. That everybody knows who I am. I'm Professor Liu, I'm Dr. Liu. And so in those spaces, I'm given privileges, right? Like people will defer to me, people will seek me out for my advice, other things like that, what you would expect out of deference to a professor. But I know once I push out those two double doors to walk up to my car, I'm an Asian guy not an Asian. I'm not even Asian American. I'm just an Asian guy walking up the sidewalk to my car, and because my privilege, that power, that those affordances are limited to that space and the people who know me, I know that I don't really have any kind of racial privilege, because outside of that particular space, I'm nobody. I'm just a racialized person in that space, right? So, yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, which I think, like, when we talk about the notions of white privilege and we talk about actually, like, the experience that you just described is something that I think that myself and Remoy are able to relate to on a level that's unspoken even. Like, I could see you and know that that's what you go through. And I think that this notion of white privilege, and when we talk about white supremacy and patriarchy, you know, altering the context of having that understanding be so unconscious is something that takes forever, because people aren't willing to put themselves at issue to see how they directly contribute to that on a daily basis, white or not white, right?
I mean, what you're pointing to is, like, people of color, minorities, like, their value is contingent on whiteness and white supremacy. Like, our appreciable value, our identity, the value of our identity, the value of our skin is all contingent on the white supremacy in the room, in the space, that's all around us. Like, and even that's so personalized, like, that's personalized within ourselves. Like, we will only appreciate ourselves for the parts of ourselves that are appreciable by white supremacy. And it's so interesting because, myself included, I've been in this struggle and this fight of being a man of color, trying to work my ass off. And this is what we talk about that is so exhausting and taxing, to kind of assimilate into the tradition of masculinity, or, as we've been saying, white masculinity. But however, conversely, the tradition of masculinity, it's like almost innate to exclude men of color or minorities and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And it's just this horrible, frustrating cycle or paradox.
Yeah. This idea of, it's really built on this kind of racial meritocracy, is what you're talking about. This idea that if we work hard and we accumulate the money and the status and the privileges and the house and the neighborhood and the schooling, then therefore we are potentially free of racial animus. That is not the case, right?
That's impossible in this world.
That's impossible. So you can be super successful, an African American man, driving in your latest model Mercedes Benz, and you'll still get pulled over by the cops.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't mean anything. And so for some African American men, they're able to reconcile, like, I understand what this is. For others, they're like, I don't understand what this is, right? Do you know who I am? It's like, it doesn't matter who you are, because all I see is the color of your skin. And that's what I mean. It's the limits of those, is the limit of the privilege. Like, you can keep doing all of these things, but you're going to work yourself to death. And in fact, there's a term that psychologists use. It's called John Henryism. And John Henryism comes from this idea, this fable of John Henry, who was pitted against a machine that I think was like a pile driver machine. And John Henry is an African American man, and he was pit against this machine in terms of how well they could perform. And he beat the machine in terms of how many things that he could do, but in doing so, he died. Right. And so what John Henryism speaks to.
That's not where I thought you were going with that. Oh my God. Anyway.
Well, what John Henryism points to is that we take on the stress of working hard, and we take on, and that level of stress is, at the most objective level, I'm gonna say, you know, everybody who is working hard experiences that particular level of stress. And that particular level of stress has a metabolic consequence. In other words, it causes fatigue, it causes stress, and the stress is deleterious to our body over the long term. But for men of color, women of color, communities of color, there are also all these additional stresses that we take on that aren't related to just working hard. It's all these other things that we take on that compound, that are additive, amplify all the other stresses that we deal with, right? So I could be working on my desk, and I certainly am dealing with the stress of, let's say, getting something done. And then I have an interaction with a coworker, and then in that interaction, I wonder, was that racist? And that particular piece then becomes additive to the stress that I'm already dealing with in terms of getting this particular thing done. And so for many people of color, we're working hard, we can accumulate, we can have all the external badges of success, but internally we're killing ourselves as a result of it, right? We're experiencing the metabolic, the physiological consequences of this amplified stress on our system. And that's the problem that middle and upper class people of color experiences. That certainly we have let's say the external indicators of success, but in doing so, we take on these metabolic problems that are deleterious to our health, our overall health, right? So, and part of it, and what that points to is that there's an environment of racism that is separate from just the stress and everything that comes with being a man, masculinity, working hard, doing all those other things that are all there. It's this environment of racism that we also have to contend with as people of color, and especially men of color, right? That men of color face a particular kind of racism that we're constantly negotiating, struggling with, dealing with.
So we're talking about kind of like the impact of being in these white spaces, consistently having to negotiate between being ourselves and performing a version of ourselves that's acceptable in these spaces. And then we go home, right, to our own communities, to our own families. And there's this, I mean, we're home, and we talked a little bit about this a few weeks ago with D'Lo, with one of our previous guests, and it's like we're in our communities of color within a larger context of white supremacy, right? So then I think where it really kind of starts to get hairy is that those notions of hegemony, then somehow they're all kind of like built into our fiber, right? Like how you're saying we're metabolically affecting us. So then we're transposing those ideals, those ways of being within our own community, except when you're a man, there is a way in which that can turn into a way of having more power than you do on the outside. And I think that's where things can kind of get tough. Or if you're even a single parent who happens to be a woman, or who is masculine of center, whatever. And I think that's where, like, there's like this kind of almost like a post-colonial attitude that happens in the home that I think, I'm wondering in your research how that plays out. Like, is that something that you speak to with the, with the folks that you talk to? Like, how do you reconcile with that?
Yeah. Well, one piece that I know from my work with men of color in the clinical practice, but also a little bit from the research, is that in the home spaces, in the private spaces of our home, that unfortunately sometimes is the place where all of that anger and frustration gets put forward, right? And we see it in TV shows and movies that have sort of demonstrated that, for a man of color outside of that home space or outside of their community of color, they have to perform a certain way, and they have to take the racism that they experience, and they can't do anything about it because in doing something about it, they risk being arrested or just
killed.
They risk getting killed, right? So I mean, there are like three options. They're fired, arrested, killed. So, and you just have to take it because there's some level of understanding that outside of this, I don't have a lot of other economic opportunities, right? I'm limited. So if I have this, then I really have to hold on to it. So there are very few men of color who have multiple economic opportunities that they can move between different spaces. And so in the home spaces, sometimes that becomes the place, unfortunately, where that frustration, anger gets put forward. The exertion of power and status becomes performed in those spaces, and to the detriment of our families and the kids. And um, the sometimes it comes across as teaching the children in that family system what it means to be a child of color, right? And it's not always developmental and productive, but that anger and frustration is expressed in a way to say, you need to learn this. You need to understand what it means to be outside of this home, and you need to learn these skills because this is going to be important for you to be able to survive outside of this home, right? And sometimes it's gentle and nurturing. Sometimes it's harsh and punishing. And what I would say is that part of that is the frustration and anger, and some of that is just the fear of your child, right? The fear that you don't know what to do because outside of the space, I don't know. I have no control over you. I have no control over what happens outside of here,
And we know what the context is made of. We know what the context is made of. We know what, so
right,
it's, yeah.
Right. There's a story, I think it was Gabriella Union who talked about this with her son. And I think she has a teenage son, and she got really angry at her teenage son because her teenage son was running around the neighborhood with some white friends, and they would be running up to. I think they're doing something where they're running up the driveways of neighbors' homes or something like that. And she talked about the fear, and what she was trying to tell her son is that you can't do that. I mean, your white friends can do that, but you cannot do that, because you can't, right? Yeah. It's not like, I don't care if you think you come from an entertainment family and we have money and all these other things. They don't know you. They don't know. They just see a black face running up to their driveway, and, there are deadly consequences related to that. So, so some of that is the frustration, the anger, also the fear. And white supremacist patriarchy does very well in exploiting minority patriarchies as well. So what I mean by that is that there are patriarchies, there's sexism in our community, there's misogyny in our community. So we're not free of that. But in a dominant context, in a white supremacist patriarchal context, as Bell Hooks talks about it, it exploits minority misogyny, minority communities, patriarchy, and feels like they're linked together, right? Supports it, animates it, empowers it, because it works to the function of controlling our communities through sexism and misogyny. So it feels very normal. They can say, the guy down the street, the white guy down the street does the same thing. So I feel like it's normal. And in that way, that's where the sort of minority sexism and patriarchy gets connected with dominant white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, i.e. Bell Hooks. So, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess so. I do want to go back to this question of intersectionality, right? Kind of like bouncing off of what you just said about essentially having the experience of the performance of masculinity, which of course is something that affects us all, but within specific parameters of various communities of color, there is, for myself as a woman of color, there's been this ongoing conversation, as we talked about in the beginning of the show, of traditional feminism just excluding us, right? So if we're talking about, like for men, like how do we factor in intersectionality when we talk about unmasking the performance of masculinity?
Let's see. There's some polling data that came out. I think it was a generation. What do they? I forgot the survey itself. But what it showed was the millennial group, the 20s, the 30s, currently in our society group. For millennials of color, they recognize racism much more clearly and much better than white millennials. White millennials still, they're still, I mean, they're open to gender fluidity. They're open to sexuality, LGBT issues. They still have a harder time with race and racism. And so when it comes to intersectionality, what it says to me is that it's going to be important when we talk about masculinity and intersectionality, that we keep the focus on race and racism, that it's easier to move off of the conversation to talk about sexuality and to talk about larger gender issues as a separate contained entity, but we really need to talk about it as race and racism informed understanding of gender and masculinity, that we can't separate the two, right? We just, and those conversations I've had with students in my classroom, what they want to do is they just want to focus on this idea. Let's say, our society is much more open to LGBTQ communities, and that's true to some extent in some places. I think there's, I think there's it's much more open, but in certain spaces and in certain states and communities, I don't think that's necessarily the case still. Well, I know it's not the case, but we want to believe that that's an issue, and I think, and that's good. But even in that realm, if you introduce the notion of race and racism, what you start to find is that when we talk about LGBTQ issues, there's a huge race division in the community, right? That the privileges of sexuality and identity are still largely pushed towards white LGBTQ communities, and LGBTQ communities of color are not necessarily part of that larger conversation, right? And so introducing it really complicates it, and white people don't want to have that conversation about why it's much more complicated, because even in those spaces, white supremacy still is a part of it. Whiteness still is a part of it, right? It's still, I was reading, I forget which blog this was, but I was just reading again, some folks talking about how, the pride parades simply are still very white centric. It's not inclusive of bodies of color in those spaces, right? It's still very white centric in terms of its aesthetics, in terms of its ideology, in terms of its politics. It's just not accepting of the politics of intersectionality, even in those spaces. And so it's really important when we start talking about masculinity and intersectionality that we constantly talk about the importance of race, because race and racism and white supremacy brings us back to the discussion of history, institutions, culture, right? It brings us back to what else is going on, because while there are privileges and advancements going on for some communities, still those communities are largely white communities. Right? So,
I mean, what you've talked about throughout this conversation is how white supremacy or race and racism informs a lot of our other systems and conventions, and that's what you're kind of pointing to. So when we talk about the performance of masculinity, or we have a gender criticism, we have to be able to see that white supremacy in some fashion informs that race and racism, right, and that masculinity, and that's a very specific critical lens that we always need to keep at the forefront of our thinking as we move forward in this masculinity conversation. And I'm wondering if you could. So you've put together. You're the editor of the Psychology of Men and Masculinity journal. How much does that inform the goals of the journal, and what are kind of the goals of the journal, and how did this all come about?
The journal itself is part of a division of the American Psychological Association. So the large association, the American Psychological Association. One of my interest areas is men and masculinity, and in that interest area of the division is the journal. And as the editor of the journal, I'm given the privilege of identifying a particular goal that I want for the journal. And so for the time that I'm editor, I'm allowed to look for manuscripts and talk about things that I think are important in terms of advancing our scholarship in the field. And so for me, during my tenure as the editor, I want to look at much more race and racism, culturally derived issues around masculinity. I'm also interested in much more global aspects of masculinity as well. And so what I've found is that in the last few years that I've been editor, we've had much more a greater increase of subscription of submissions of manuscripts from all over the world, and it's interesting because it gives you a different. And it's from Europe, from Australia, from different parts of Asia, and so it gives us a different sense of how we understand masculinity globally.
Well, speaking of globally and speaking of currently globally, post Me Too era, post Trump America, how have you seen, observationally, as you're saying, how have you seen the culture shift around masculinity generally?
I really, I wish I could be much more optimistic, you know? I really do. I mean, I'm
not surprised by that answer.
So if you were to know me longer, I'm actually quite an optimist, right? I think things will get better. I do believe things will get better, right? But in this current iteration of what we're experiencing, not only in the United States, but also globally, we're seeing a nostalgic notion of masculinity and nationalism that is really problematic. And those two things are tied together. It's nationalism, masculinity, but also gender roles. They're actually all tied together. Nationalism is not separate from gender roles or classism and those other pieces. So
they're inextricable.
Yeah, and so I think we're seeing that happen right now.
What's the nostalgia for white masculinity, to your point, right? Like it's like completely like yeah.
It's a very white masculine dominant. It's the attempt to reassert this idea of the alpha male thing, and but it's the white alpha male masculine type that is really valued. And that's much more, I think, prominent in some of the media spaces. I think that, but I do think there's an end to it. There is going to be an end to it because there's always been an end to it. And then we'll see another resurgence of multiple masculinities, which is going to be important. And I think we're starting to seeing some of that happen. So I do think there's some positive notions that are there. They're starting to get to the surface. But right now there's going to be a period of time, and I don't know how long that's going to be, but it's going to be bad, right? And it's just this resurgence of this very nostalgic notion of the most deleterious ideologies of masculinity that we can find.
So we talk about like the nostalgia for white nationalism and white masculinity, but what about like potentially a shift in men of color and patriarchy? Like, have you seen a shift like in these days of, within communities of color around that?
I don't know. It's hard to say, right? I mean, I see pockets of it. I see expressions of it that are important. And I see expressions of healthy relationships, of heterosexual as well as across the gender spectrum, as well as relationship spectrum. So I see instances of it. I'm waiting to see it much more consistently. Much more constant basis of it. But I do think it's there, and I think we want to have better relationships. I think we want to see ourselves in better relationships as well, and much more healthy relationships. So I do think it's there. What I would say is that I don't think that we'll be able to find it through the modeling that we get from whiteness. So and I think that's what their struggle is, that we've got to find something that's separate from or different from the ways in which we think white relationships have to be seen as the most healthy style, most healthy type, right? Yep.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. I think context is decisive. And I mean, if we're thinking about this as like a cultured environment, there are certain things that can grow in an environment that we've been cultivating. And as long as we continue to cultivate the specific environment, then anything that we bring about is going to be a function of directly that. So, and I think that also brings back kind of the idea that, you know, people of color are being valued through the performance of whiteness in a way, and how actually it's in the best interest of all of society, if we're going to move forward in any way that's a departure from what we're currently doing, for us to be valuing ourselves for who we actually are, separate from supremacy. So
yeah, and I think the media is going to be, the types of media that we're exposed to is going to be extremely important. I think the more that we can get faces of color into TV shows and movies and other media platforms is going to be increasingly important, because right now I would argue that with the preponderance of white faces in movies and TV shows, we're still bombarded by, we're still socialized and acculturated to how to understand white emotional ways of being. And we need more faces of color in those spaces, so that we have much more variability, so that whiteness isn't the dominant image that we see in our social spaces.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly. So, well, what a conversation. I think this is going to be a great conversation for our listeners, and I'm excited to see the feedback that we get from it. So I just want to thank you for being here, for your contribution, for
I'm
your
going to
work.
say something. It probably doesn't work with like the whole masculinity, this whole fucking podcast for the last 2 years, but man, you the man. I like you, Dr. Liu. You the man.
Thanks.
I mean, you're not telling. It's not like not a fact. That is a fact. Yes.
But I mean, there's something problematic about saying you the man, and like, you know what I mean.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you very much. I do appreciate it. Thank you very much for giving me the time and the space to have this conversation. You're lovely people, and just thank you very much for doing this. It's really important.
Thank you. I mean, so how can our listeners find you besides the journal? Because I think they have to be like scholars, right, to access the journal, or how does that work?
Yeah, unfortunately, right? The journal
to,
still is limited to institutional academic spaces. But I'll be at the University of Maryland starting in August, and so I'll be there. So if people want to find me, I'm right now in the process of, well, I guess I could make this plug. Right now in the process of writing a book for Oxford University Press, and the book is titled The Psychology of Privilege, White Supremacy, and Power.
Oh, wow. Damn.
So that book is slated to go to the publisher in May of 2019. So somewhere between there and the end of the year in 2019, it should be published. So that would be available out there.
I'll be waiting
awesome.
on Goodreads. I'll be looking at Goodreads every day.
That's beautiful.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, no, awesome. So we're gonna be posting information. I mean, there is information on you out there, which is great. So we'll be linking that for the folks. You guys can always find us, of course, at Masculinity Podcast on Facebook, Masculinity Pod on Twitter, and Masculinity Pod as well on Instagram, always with a K. And if you have any questions, please send us questions and comments at masculinitypodcast@whoistheo.com. And leave us a review. We've got SoundCloud, we've got
Damn
iTunes,
it, leave us a review.
we've got Stitcher, we're on all of the platforms. So let us know how you're feeling about this conversation. Let us know if there's something that you want to hear in this conversation.
Tell us how smart we are.
Yeah, or if you don't think we're smart, we want to hear that too. I love feedback.
Oh, Sam, I'm so good at feedback. I hate it. Yeah. Do whatever you want.
You are smart, lovely people.
See, we get feedback.
Thank you.
You are.
Leave it on iTunes.
All right, guys. Well, thank you for listening. And we will see you next time. My name is Samantha Nzesi.
It's your boy, Remoy George Philip, the first.
And this has been Masculinity. Ciao.
Peace.